Welcome to Ideagen TV. Today we have with us Peter Fatelnig, Minister Counselor for the Digital Economy at the European Union, Delegation to the United States. Peter, welcome.
Many thanks, George. Many thanks. Great pleasure being with you here.
You know, Peter, it's always wonderful to connect with you and to have a conversation. Certainly, we'd love our global audience today during this summit to hear from you, to hear directly from you on what are your roles and responsibilities at the EU in your role as Minister Counselor for the Digital Economy?
Well, I'm working out of the Washington, D.C. office in a diplomatic role, and often I describe diplomacy as a form of journalism, except it's a two-way journalism. So my job is explaining the European Union digital policies and objectives to my friends here in the US, and vice versa. Equally, I explain US policy to Brussels. Now you can imagine that translation is quite an effort in this process. It's a very great job. It's a lot to learn, a lot to do, as digital is really one of these key policy areas we are focusing on. And perhaps I could just add, would be interesting, just imagine this pandemic would have hit us 20 years ago. If we all roll back 20 years, how exactly would we cope with the situation?
That's right. It's really, Peter, it's really remarkable in that, we just a few short months ago had a conversation about you presenting at a summit, and based on the changes in the format, we now have a digital convening, and very interesting. I'd like to go back. You talked about going back. How about going back to when you first started your career? What was it like when you first started with the EU?
It was a very different time. I think best characterized, that was a world driven by hardware. So tech, when we spoke about tech 20, 25 years ago or 30 years ago, tech was electronics, and electronics were circuit boards. Code was hardwired. That was the world when I started working for the Commission. That was the world when I started working in industry before. And in fact, a little anecdote here is I bought a Commodore C64 in 1985, which was my first way into programming in BASIC. But there was basically no use for software at that time. I found it, to be frank, I found it quite boring. I mean, I was working on little programs, but there were no users. There was nobody using it. So that was a world of hardware, and it has changed so much in the last 20 or 30 years.
Peter, that's really fascinating, to hear your perspective about the beginning of Peter's career with the European Union. Can you tell us a little bit about how you helped to drive forward internet innovation policies within the European Union?
Mm-hmm. If you allow me once more sort of a bit of a flashback on my career, I started as a junior engineer. My first job was with Texas Instruments at the semiconductor factory in Germany. I wanted to get into this really cool business that was really top-notch engineering at that time. I wanted to know that technology and to learn that business. And fabs were at that time a place you could walk into. I worked in there with protective gear, and products were handled manually, shifted from machine to machine, and for the various next processing steps. There was a lot less software at that time, a lot less process-driven software. When you go into a fab today, it's just one big machine, the size of a large building. It's sealed off, fully automatic, robots are moving everything, software is controlling everything, costs you $5 billion before you get the first silicon out of such a factory. So what we have seen is that the last 30 years, software really has eaten the world. And I think this is something we have to appreciate, because there are profound policy implications. This is just the way things are today. It's not whether we like it or not, doesn't matter. This is the way the things are. And the better we can recognize the pros and cons, the better I think we will be able to move forward.
That's right. That's right. And after such a long career in the tech industry and dealing with technology, how has your background really helped to inform and affect a key role in helping us to overcome this global situation with the pandemic? How do you see technology playing a role in that?
Well, before we look into the future, let's maybe look a little bit back. Let's see what is at play already. So we have today an exchange of information, which is unprecedented. The public sector has a lot of information at their fingertips. Governments around the globe communicate within seconds. So there is a strong interaction with citizens. Citizens are part of that living of the pandemic as never before. We have all information, statistics available, updated every few seconds on a variety of websites. So I think that the level of information is very different what we have today. There is research ongoing in the background. High performance computers are being tasked to model drugs for finding treatment and vaccines. That hasn't happened, but it's happening as we speak right now around the world, not just here in the US. That happens in China, in Europe, in India, and in other places. Contact tracing is probably the next thing which is going to come. There's no point in employing 10,000 of people who are tracing people across a country, trying to give them a ring, and then they are not home or whatever. So there's a lot more we can do. So if we think longer term, I have the feeling we ain't seen nothing yet. And one of the things I can clearly see coming in managing that pandemic and mastering a similar situation better is artificial intelligence. We will see that this technology will be added to essentially every product and service. And AI is providing today already services for specialized for addressing the challenges of this pandemic. Let me tell you about a German company. It's a small startup. They developed software for spotting cancer on lung CT scans. There are many companies doing that out there. They claim to be very good. Now they pivoted within a fraction of a second in spotting COVID-19 on lung CT scans. And that's being integrated as we speak into the hardware or into the scanners sold by Siemens and Agfa worldwide. So there's a lot of really cool stuff through this crisis coming into the products and services.
That's right. And I think that's what, if there's a silver lining, it's everything that's happened. It may be that. It may be examples of like what you just cited, where you have a repurposing or a new discovery or an acceleration, or maybe a combination of all of those factors to help drive forward the planet in ways that previously perhaps we could not have either imagined, or maybe we didn't even think it was possible. But based on this focus and this immediacy to addressing the issue.
I agree. I think this pandemic is almost like a litmus test for mankind. Whether we are able to deploy all the technologies, all the knowledge we have, and put it to this crisis for the real benefit of people, and whether people will trust those solutions and technologies we're coming up. I don't think the answer is yet that clear. I think the answer is still outstanding. And it's going to be a very, very interesting test if all what policymakers are thinking, all what technologists are thinking is really ending up to the benefit of the people quickly.
That's right. And Peter, while we have you, and I think it's important to ask this question, in terms of our global audience, so we have folks from just about every country in the world on the planet that have access and are watching this summit, this digital summit on innovation. What is the European Union's perspective, or the European perspective, I should say, on the pandemic? And then how do you see Europe and vis-a-vis that, the planet coming out of this?
I'm not sure if we have enough time in this conversation for going through an exhaustive discussion on this. I think, let me start that way. Rahm Emanuel used to say, apparently he's still saying, that never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think that describes quite well how the EU is approaching the situation. There was a very quick taking of ownership of this crisis. There was very little discussion of should we do something, maybe not. There was a very quick reaction saying, okay, here it is, we got to do something, we got to move. That quickly liberated early on thinking, not only about how do we mitigate the crisis, but sort of after the first masks were handed out, people were starting thinking immediately, what does it mean for afterwards? What do we have to do to get to a situation which is maybe not the situation as before, but a situation even better as we had before? And I think what played a big role in this kind of thinking was that the timing was, I have to say, at the end of the day, was very fortunate. This is an unfortunate crisis, but that it came in March in Europe was just a few months after the new European Union leadership took office. They were all in the mode of planning and rolling out new policies. And what you see now, that the European Union has used that crisis as an opportunity to come back with stronger EU policies, with a bigger EU budget, which addresses not only the crisis, but addresses of what sort of society now or in this 20 to 25. That's the planning horizon the European Commission right now is addressing.
Incredible perspective, Peter, and as always. And so during the course of your career, what is an example of one of your favorite projects that you've worked on and why?
I think there are a couple of projects and initiatives where I entertain a vanity of being proud. I work for a public organization, so normally one isn't that proud of work you do there. But perhaps if I can name one, it is a project called FiWare, or Future Internetware. We developed in that project an operating system, an open source operating system for cities, for factories, or in fact for any complex data environment. It breaks information silence, makes IoT simple, and transforms data into knowledge. And I think the key here was it's secure, open source, complying to EU values and becoming a real export now. So because today, if you talk about data platforms, if you go in a city or in a factory, it doesn't matter. Platforms are closed, not interoperable. You cannot port your data somewhere else easily. You're hostage very often. You're hostage to your vendors to provide this technology. And frankly speaking, often you don't get a bad deal. In particular, the public sector never gets a good deal out of tech companies providing services to them. So platforms need to be open and interoperable, and FiWare is this leading technology right now in providing that. And I'm glad and excited to see it grow every day.
Well, that's incredible. And that's a perfect segue, I believe, to my next question, which is related to the 17 global goals of the United Nations. So you probably heard me talk a lot about these. I know you and everyone across the planet refer to these, especially with the EU's lead on a lot of these goals and awareness and effectiveness in helping to achieve those. But in a perfect world, Peter, in a perfect world, if you had the choice and the ability, which goal of the 17 would you like to see achieved first, and why?
Well, I'm not sure if that is a trick question you're asking here, because you know very well that the Sustainable Development Goals, all of them are an interlinked system of policy indicators. So picking one is kind of neglecting the others, and I'm neglecting that they are actually connected. But you make me pick one, so I will pick one. And my lucky number in life has always been the 13, so I go for the 13, which is climate action. And there is no question today, climate action, there's no question that mankind has changed the face of the planet whether you call it climate change or something else, humans have introduced risks in the ecosystem we find hard and costly to manage today. That's pretty much a fact. You can look wherever you want. And maybe it is the right of humans to do so, to do and use that planet in whatever way they want. But from at the moment, it's the only planet we have. So we probably want to keep it habitable, perhaps retain most of the charm of this planet we love so much. So if you ask people out there what they love, I mean, people love nature. Flora and fauna is to be retained, what citizens want from policymakers. So it's not a question whether we want to do it. What is interesting is, if I pick climate action, it's maybe the outcome is a better environment, or more or less declining environment. But perhaps what is the more interesting thing here is with the Sustainable Development Goals, by pursuing one, you can get different outcomes, several outcomes. Clearly for the European Union and the EU Green Deal, it's about the economy. Achieving a climate neutral society and economy by 2050, this is the target, not just for a better environment, but this is also a better economic or environmental target, because we would like to build those industries which are necessary for society and economy in 10, 20, 30 years from now. And that's an economic objective. And what I like here is that by just picking one, because the long I think one I can address all the others in an indirect way too. And this is maybe what countries or those who are working with sustainable development goals should realize. You don't have to go after all 17. You probably can only pick one at the end of the day. Do that and then pull the others along with it.
That's incredible insight. And I like how you from an analytical perspective broke down the goals and basically chose the goal that perhaps is most important to you personally and professionally, and then created that context for the connectivity to the rest. I personally like goal number 17, which is the partnerships piece as well, because without the partnerships, you also can't achieve all the rest. So it's really fascinating. But what I agree on wholeheartedly, and what I believe Ideagen espouses is the belief that we can achieve these global goals by 2030, that it's absolutely vital to have awareness at a baseline of the goals. What are the goals? And for people to understand that there was a unanimity, that the United Nations agreed unanimously on these 17 broad goals. There was no dissension around the final agreement around these 17 broad goals. And to your point, no matter what you call any of these goals and how you frame them, they're all critically important, and every country in the world, including the United States, has agreed to these. So I think for all of us as citizens of global citizens of the planet and the rest, it's great to be aware and to then, if we can, do our part to help achieve the goals by 2030.
If I may add something here.
Yeah.
It's almost a little paradox that some people believe the United States is not or should not be the leader on the Sustainable Development Goals. Clearly, society and economy is this most optimist society on the planet I have ever met. A society completely living in this anticipation of a better future and mobilizing today everything in order to get there. So it's sort of this super big asset the United States has as society, as economy, in just coping with essentially any problem coming down the timeline. And I don't think it would be a disservice to call the United States maybe not a leader in this.
That's right, and it is, and I think when the MDGs concluded and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, began, and that shift to focusing on all of the countries involved instead of just developing countries, perhaps, that then became important. And then that's why I believe the awareness piece is so important, because these are not the MDGs. The MDGs were a great start, as everyone knows, but the SDGs include problems and issues that are right here in the United States of America or any other country in the world. So it's not just we're trying to help another place, it's we're helping our communities too. So there's that angle that I think is also critical for the awareness of these global goals. I mean, it's one planet, to your point. You know, there's poverty across the planet, including in the United States. Mm-hmm. There's human trafficking right here in the United States. All sorts of issues that are not somewhere else. They're also right here. So I think it's important to have that contextualization of what is important and how it impacts your community as well, in order to really be able to understand how you can even make a difference in your community and at the same time be helping to achieve the global goals, right? So it's not separate. It's all interconnected. And I think, you know, I'd like to ask you, Peter, what, from your vantage point, because you live so close to this, is one good way to help achieve the global goals?
Well, it's probably this same recommendation for any other policy. Policy only works if it has a positive effect on the people, if it improves the individual circumstances of a person, or if it has a positive economic effect. If you can't show that from a policy, it's not going to work. Now, and I think now there's actually thinking about it, a second element to it. Policy only works if it creates a positive perception by the citizens. So people understand why this is being done, they're part of that process. Is by ensuring co-creation and a participatory governance model. This is nothing you can really organize completely top-down. It doesn't work. You're not flexible enough. So you have to serve the whole value chain, which starts with the individual citizen, goes to civil rights communities, goes into the industry, goes into all branches of government. Only if you adopt an approach, which is this participatory governance model, you have a chance of implementing any of them. It's also an old management rule, you know, that you have to co-locate the means of achieving something with the responsibility of achieving something. And very often, the means and actions are in the lower parts of government branches.
Peter, incredible insights. And so if you had a question or something to do to our global audience that's listening today, and it is an ask post summit, what would that be? What would you ask folks to do?
There's, you know, societal and economic progress are a step-by-step process, and there is a balance required, or do you have to balance the attention to immediate policy needs versus long-term policy goals? But there is one piece where I think we're not paying enough attention to, and I would appreciate if the audience at least would sort of take a moment to reflect upon what I would like to propose. We have to create trust in a digital world. I believe we live in a trust crisis right now. Trust in government is eroding. Trust in business is rock bottom low already. Trust is hard to create by rules, so we probably have no real approach as government to create that trust. So I would urge people to think about how can we address this trust crisis before we get into doing other things. So what can government do? What should civil society do? What should businesses and business associations do to create trust? And those who are more skeptical about what I'm saying about trust, I would highly recommend looking at some statistics of Pew Research, particularly the one from November last year, 2019, which looked at trust in the digital economy. The numbers are devastating. Very, very, very low levels of trust by consumers and citizens in these marvelous technologies we all want to have, but we just don't trust them.
You know, Peter, that's incredible. You know, and I often think about that and refer to that. I think there was a time when perhaps when there was less information, and there were only a few sources of that information that you could argue maybe were trusted. And today you have limitless sources of information, if you Google anything on any issue, 1 million answers will come up. And who then do you know to trust? And I think that may, my own perspective, but maybe plays a role in it. There's just so many sources of information thanks to this digital world that we live in that perhaps it's tough to put that badge or that seal of this is a trusted source on just one entity when you're getting so much information from so many different angles. And so I think it's a perfect shift to, Peter, if I were to ask you, what is an inhibitor of helping to achieve the goals? In other words, what are some of the roadblocks that you see in helping to achieve these goals? You know, just a few months ago, again, we were looking at this runway to 2030, 3,500 odd some days to get to 2030. There's a roadmap, as you mentioned, across Europe and throughout the world, new leadership in certain countries. Everyone's excited to do something either new or to implement projects, et cetera. And then we get this global pandemic. And, you know, there's optimism that perhaps we'll come out of this with some good news, perhaps. But in the end, there's been a large toll on a whole planet. The whole planet, really, for the first time in history, endured something together. We're still, by the way, enduring it, right? And it's a collective experience, unlike anything anyone's ever seen. Everyone in the farthest reaches of the world is experiencing the same thing. And so beyond that, what do you see as that roadblock, as that inhibitor for achieving the goals? Has this set us back in terms of achieving the global goals, or do we have an opportunity, perhaps, just a question, to accelerate the potential of achieving these global goals by 2030?
I'm a relentless optimist, and that's not by experience, that's by choice. So I think you're right. First, we have to use the crisis. There is no other option. You can decide whether the glass is half full or half empty. That's a decision. And we should decide that the glass is half full and take it from there. The biggest inhibitor, and I think you alluded to it a bit in your question or in your previous comment, is that there is so much noise today out there. This noise factor in this conversation is disinformation and misinformation. And it's a tremendously strong signal today in the public space. And there is a tangible risk that this noise becomes so loud that society loses the ability to act rationally. I have no doubt that we are probably at the cusp of losing control of this, of losing an understanding of what's real, what's fake, what do I want, what is my role here. And we should not neglect the risks coming with it, because it's like disorientation. You can only achieve a goal if you know where to go. If we lose the ability to locate where we are, the way we want to go, we are hopelessly lost in space completely. And I think these disinformation and misinformation campaigns are very effective and low-cost methods of disorienting entire countries for a very long period of time. This is something, and I'm not suggesting that I have all the answers to the question, because for years we have been looking on working on this topic. There are gradual improvements possible, but I think there is a deeper issue. And I wonder whether the deeper issue has to do with education and how we educate people.
That's right. And there's no doubt that having, again, those trusted sources of information is vital, because, again, we're getting so much of it. There's so much information, and there's, so many different aspects to this that it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish between, not necessarily just what is true and what isn't, but where are the gray lines here, and where are the guardrails in having a conversation that, you understand what the real facts are, I should say. Like, I like when folks are talking about the pandemic and they're talking about the science and the data. I know that you can have different sets of data, and I know that you can look at science and have different experiments and come to different conclusions based on on what the sets are that you input. However, you can develop a mean to develop that average where you can have a fairly decent understanding of what the reality is that you're dealing with. And I think, to the credit of governments around the world, I think they've been strident, including the European Union, together with the United States, in helping to develop this sense of here's where we are. I don't think there's been any kind of a disagreement that I can see that says, well, no, that's not accurate in terms of the science and the data around what we're experiencing. And so, shifting a bit, the Sustainable Development Goals, multilateralism, is that a good approach? Is that the only approach?
George, I think today we already live in a multipolar world with competing socioeconomic systems. I think this is what we should first recognize. I'm not suggesting whether the EU's social market economy, the US capitalist system, or China is doing best. Doesn't matter, and anyway, what's best in this definition here? But there are different ways of organizing, different approaches of organizing society and the economy. We have to recognize that, and we have to think hard how to cooperate effectively among those systems, different systems, and yet compete at the same time. And that's the key in here, because there's nothing wrong in cooperation or neither in competition, but we need a rule book for that. Otherwise, it becomes a crazy run, and everybody runs in whatever direction. What is helpful in multilateralism, or what we start learning now, is that we have to do away with the notion of winner. This is not about being first or being a winner. That's not a metric to measure any success of multilateralism. The rule book I referred to is for the multilateral cooperation, what these international norms and rules we can agree on and rely on. This rule book, without such a rule book, progress will be elusive in society. We will only pocket temporary successes at the expense of somebody else, but as a society and economy worldwide, we will not be able to move forward if we are not able to build or go back on an agreed rule book. If we question everything all the time, you get nowhere. And this is a little bit the question. So is there a useful option to multilateralism? If we think 20 to 50 years ahead, I don't think so. I think we will have to come back to developing international norms and rule books and get as many as we can around the table to agree with them. It will take time and money to do so, but the investment will be great because we will be able to stand on the shoulders of those who have developed those rules.
That's right, Peter. And so, based on your experience, and you've seen so much in the development and the quantum changes, to use that term, quantum changes in technology. I mean, we've seen, just in the past decade, unimaginable advances in technology across the board. Internet of Things, just technology for vehicles, you name it, healthcare, finance. What do you see, Peter, as a paradigm change, having the potential of a paradigm change in technology?
At least right now, I spend a lot of time working on artificial intelligence. And I think the more I see about this technology, the more I start understanding how profoundly it will change how we organize society, how our economy will be run. And there are several reasons. First, it's clear that already today, artificial intelligence drives more and more data-driven services. This narrow AI does a pretty good job. I'm using Spotify. It's pretty cool what I get recommended there. It's not just taking you down to a rabbit hole. It's a pretty good way of letting you experience the whole universe of music. However, what basically is maybe the downside is to understand the inner functionings remain elusive and to most of us, and it's even counterintuitive at many times. So this leads to this mystification of AI, and and giving rise to speculation. So I think we should spend a lot more time on understanding what AI is, how AI is working. I don't have to understand all the deep parts of it, but to give a good understanding that this is a technology which is useful to be deployed as much as possible. You know, I have a car, it has a combustion engine. I don't know exactly how a combustion engine functions, but I think somebody has thought about it. It's kind of working. I like it. So I think we have to see this AI as a bit this combustion engine of basically every data-driven service in the future. What is interesting here is that Finland put out a course to train 1% of its entire population on AI. That's about a 20-hour course everybody can take. It's called Elements of AI. It's also available in English. Some 410,000 people have taken that course so far, and it's for an audience of you and me and everybody out there to understand there's nothing mystical. This is technology. Somebody made it, and it's working well, and the risk can be managed. And this is something we should perhaps take as another example or an objective here of let's train 1% of the entire world population on AI.
Peter, you've created a thought-provoking moment because, you know, prior to the pandemic, we heard a lot about the mismatch between skilled workers and the education needed to get into those skilled positions, and then the availability of those positions. So millions of jobs not aligned with the available skill sets. And now we're looking at this pandemic, which is forcing us to really rethink industries that you would have not, at least in the near term, thought about rethinking, like the restaurant industry. Think about the transformation that's happening digitally and otherwise. Think about the financial services industry. Healthcare is one of the ones that we're really looking at. I mean, if you look at healthcare delivery and telemedicine and all of the things you're talking about, and add a layer of AI onto that, like you mentioned at the onset of this program during this summit today, thinking about being able to spot lung cancer in these x-rays from a digital perspective, perhaps faster than the human eye, or equally important, maybe more accurately than the human eye. Then we're talking about game-changing situations. And then let's think about for a moment the world coming together in record time to help develop what will potentially be a vaccine for this virus, and how all these companies, all the barriers between scientists have opened up for collaboration to allow for that understanding on what is happening in labs across the world to again be able to address this pandemic. I want to applaud you and everything that you're doing, Peter. I know you're a huge advocate for technology, and as Minister Counselor for the digital economy, certainly it's an important issue for you. I really applaud your work and your vision, and you really are an optimist, and so am I, which makes it a great, it's going to be a great conversation when you get two optimists together. We both believe in a better day tomorrow. I want to thank you personally and professionally for taking time to join us during this Digital Innovation Summit presented globally by Microsoft. We could not be more thrilled to be having conversations with folks like yourself, because all of these issues are so important. We could go on for several hours and make it a summit in and of itself. Unfortunately, I know your time is limited, so I want to again say thank you. Thank you, Peter. How can folks find out more about your work at the European Union?
Follow us. We are on Twitter, European Union Delegation to the United States.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for having me. Greatly appreciate it.
Peter, thank you.
Take
thank
good
you
care.
very much. Thank you for all you're doing. Thank you for changing the world. Ideagen TV, Innovation Summit. Thank you so much.